Loki has officially passed the tragic backstory condition. Now he can become a Straw Hat. So I think Straw Hat candidacy, that's still very much up in the air. It is possible, just because Luffy has asked him to join the crew. With Loki's backstory though, he had long since cleared any tragic requirements to join the crew almost from the very moment that he was born. After seeing Loki as a baby being tossed off by his mother and climbing back up from the underworld, that is more than enough to sell me on tragedy. And everything that happens from here on out, that's just a bonus, or whatever the negative form of bonus is. But should Loki not join, I can also see Loki going off on his own and having a bit of a cover story, adventuring the world, following in the footsteps of the Herald. If that is indeed his chosen path, it could also still be rocks or a mixture of the two. However, that could end up being quite similar to the Yamato storyline, wandering around and following in the path of Odin and such. And also Loki, he's kind of already done that. We have yet to see it in his history, but he did leave Elbaf to go terrorizing the world for a bit. But look, until Mossa is proven not to be Shirahoshi, and you know what? Even if Mossa isn't Shirahoshi, I think Loki has a very next natural destination. We gotta go and help Mossa. Loki not being able to say any goodbyes or thank yous to Ida just hit so hard. I hope in some chapter when all the bad stuff is over, we see him visiting her grave and being able to say all the things he bottled up throughout all his life. Yeah, it is quite sad. We don't actually know if Loki ever got to visit Ida's grave. Loki only just got out of jail and he's about to head right into the Herald incident, after which point he's going to have every warrior of Elbaf hunting him, which may be what causes him to flee and go out on his journey to cause assorted chaoses around the world. Because remember, Shanks only beat Loki 6 years ago. That's when he got chained to Yggdrasil. So even though Shanks is present on Elbaf right here, right now on this day, that doesn't mean that Shanks is going to fight Loki here and now, because this is still 14 years ago. And I know that this flashback started because Harridan wanted to know how Harold died, and also why, and also lots of other question words. But at this point, we could go quite far beyond that because there is so much more story to tell with Loki. For one thing, we don't know how he got his 2.6 billion berry bounty and why the bounty is special. And for another, we still have yet to see his proposal to Lola. All of that is going off on a bit of a tangent though, because the topic was Ida's grave, and how at this stage, I don't know if Loki has gotten the opportunity to visit it, and if not, that is one of the so many things that could lead him to bonding even more with Shirahoshi, who was also unable to visit her mother's grave for 10 years, and only recently had the opportunity thanks to Luffy. And if Loki is hiding the true culprit of Ida's death, then that is yet another thing that Shirahoshi could very much understand, given that she knew that Hody Jones killed Otohime, but she chose to say nothing so as not to spread further hatred. Is it really Shanks that is missing, or is it Shamrock? So these are the sorts of questions that we are going to be asking from now until the end of One Piece, because twins, that's just what happens with twins. And look, I apologize if you watching are 50% of a twins, but your existence is confusing by nature to everyone around you. Questions, so many questions that need answering. And instead of waiting, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Shanks pretty directly using Polybuzz, a free, private, and immersive AI chat platform with over 20 million characters, including Mr. Shanks. But look, I think I've got a better idea, because what I have found, right, is I have found a Boa Hancock, and I have a plan. Kiss, marry, kill. Wapol, Helmeppo, or St. Charles. And for any of you watching, please do leave your answers in the description. We might learn something about you. But as for Boa Hancock, here is her canon response. Humph! Wapol is just a pathetic former king who failed. Helmeppo, that weakling would never dare challenge me. But Charlos, I'd gladly petrify him if he dare shows his face on my island. All right, well, for a second there, I thought there might be an out-of-this-world chance that, well, you know. But Boa Hancock has essentially refused to play the game. She is above it, deeming none of these would-be suitors worthy of her, not even handsome Helmeppo, which I did try to push, but she wasn't having any of it. Although, if you keep chatting to Hancock, eventually she takes a bit of a liking to you. And that cold, stony exterior, it fades, and she starts saying things that I, quite frankly, cannot put in this video. But if you want to check out what Boa Hancock has to say, then you can and should click my link in the description to download Polybuzz today and gain access to over 20 million characters from all across media and also real life, and you can even create your own characters. Plus, you can use my code ANIME77 to unlock premium features. And just on a personal note, thank you so much to Polybuzz, as it's sponsors like them that make our videos possible, so please do check them out and show your support. But for now, it's back to you, me? Thanks, me. Shanks is reportedly lost, not because they don't see him or can't physically find him, but because his mark is gone. I don't think his mark is gone, because we do see Shanks equipped with mark on the day that Harold is killed right here in this panel, so it's probably more of a case of the Shallows Covenant not being strong enough to detect his presence. And the Shallows Covenant, it might not do anything at all. It could act as more of a promise ring. You know, I have this intent to form a bond with you, but I am in no way legally or socially bound to do so. The second Harold goes to the afterlife, the first thing Rox is going to say is, "I told you so." Yeah, if the afterlife exists, which in One Piece it does, but Harold will get up there and Rox will be smug as crap. But in Harold's defense, mate, I hope he snaps back with, "You, sir, didn't tell me shit. You knew that Emu existed. You knew that someone's rear end sat on that empty throne. And instead, what did I go and do? I accidentally made a pact with the literal devil." Rox met Harold the same day that he met Emu, and it's implied that he at least vaguely knew about Emu's existence even before all of that. So, I don't know, maybe he could have given Best Buddy just a little bit of a warning. I get that Rox was almost certainly trying to protect Harold, because just knowing about Emu is a never existed worthy offense on its own. But if I'm Rox and I'm desperately trying to convince Harold not to go further and further into the embrace of the world government, then informing him that it is run by a sea devil may have been an effective way to pull Harold back. Instead, what Rox kept saying was, "I don't know, man, that world government can't be trusted. I can't tell you exactly why, but may they're bad news." That is just vague posting. It is frustrating, unhelpful, and that is why the world is the way it is today, both fictional and real. Harold is such a fantastic character. Everything he does is interesting. He's one of the strongest characters, and unlike many, he sees it as a weakness. And him taking the burden of Elbaf and genuine joy in joining the world government is so painful to watch. Yeah, so I really like what you just said about the whole weakness business, because this is why I suspect that Harold isn't resonating with some, like a little minority of hardcore shonen readers, because they're looking for Harold to use that strength in epic fight battles, but Harold sees his own strength as a weakness. In fictional reality, this dude is at least equal to Rox. Harold could come close to ruling the world by force if he so chose to, or at least as close as Rox did. He could have been a generational menace. However, that's the thing. Harold's power, it was so great that every use of it terrified everyone around him, much like the reputation of Rox and the Rox Pirates. And so it stopped Harold from being able to form many meaningful relationships. That's also likely why Harold worked for the world government as an obscured monster. He did not want people to hear about what he was doing, because then if he ever sets very big foot on a human island, then the people will only know about the terror he's caused that gets reported in bird news. And that's why I'm very captivated by Harold. He's one of the single strongest characters to have ever existed in this world. And that power, all of that power, it cannot solve any of his problems. It can only make them worse. Which is why Ida is so important. She was a giant, but Ida didn't have that kind of physical power, which meant that, unlike most giants, Ida was never even tempted to fall back on it to solve her problems. Ida needed to come up with more unique methods that ended up being infinitely more successful than just punching your way through all of the obstacles. Harold saw what Ida could do, and he was in awe of her. That is the ability that he wanted more than anything. Harold ripped off his own horns just to get some much worse ones in the form of Emu's tattoo. Yeah, that is so perfectly said. In an effort to achieve the sense of purity and to absolve the sins Harold, he parted with his head horns, and he put in all of that time and work with the world government only for those horns to return to him, but this time in the form of the Mark of the Abyss. And not only that, but the evil that he thought his race had been responsible for has now turned out to be utterly insignificant in comparison to the evil that he sold his life to. So it's a very good pickup with the horns. I really like that symbol coming back up again. Interesting how much the Covenant tattoo looks like a Jolly Roger. The X even looks like a crossbones. Hard to believe that it's purely a coincidence. The mark does have a rather bonesome quality to it, which makes sense given the demonic nature of what this is. Horns and bones, very demony. And I suppose it depends solely on what angle it is you're viewing it from. On a slight diagonal, you do create an X with these very bone-looking markings, very crossbonular. But if you view it straight on, then it definitely resembles the world government logo quite a bit. And I suppose that's very symbolic in its own way. The idea that piracy destabilizes the world with their Jolly Roger symbols tilting the balance of power over. Note to self. If anyone ever tells you a position just opened up in being immortal, be sure to inquire on what happened to the previous holder of the position. I love this comment, but it does come with a few things to straighten out. The first thing is that immortal is, I'm not sure if that's the best translation for this, because it does have a tendency to imply that you don't age, which those with the Depth Covenant do. This is more referring to the regeneration abilities. And I believe it likely has to be an abyssal covenant to achieve that eternal youth that the five elders have. Secondly, I had lots of people in the comments last week telling me that there could be more than 13 people with a Depth Covenant and above, but I'm pretty sure that's not the case. In the official translation, it states that the Depths and Abyssal Covenants are reserved for only 13 exclusive individuals. So they've used about as many exclusory words as possible to define the number 13 there. So when being offered this immortality, yes, there are many questions, but the previous occupant of the position could have feasibly lived to death, a holy knight that just got too old and just effed off, or a holy knight who made a mistake big enough for Emu to revoke the right of life. Reading Harold and Ida's final conversation immediately made me think that this is about Oda's relationship with his wife, as he did also promise to travel the world with her, but likely feels like he's neglected her to follow his dream. So I don't know about reading that far into it, but some of this is quite true. I usually mention this as a joke, but after this chapter, it hits fairly hard. In 2004, Mr. Eiichiro Oda married Chiaki Inaba, and he told her that One Piece would be done in about 10 years, and that after it was completed, they would take a long trip around the entire world. So that done date was supposed to be 2014, which is, not now. That was going on 12 years ago now, and at the time we were still in Dressrosa. And mate, we hadn't even begun to think about starting Wano, the longest of all of the arcs in One Piece history. But don't feel too bad, because allegedly Oda and his family do go overseas at least once a year. So the grand journey hasn't happened yet, but it's not like they've been doing nothing ever since 2004. It does very much recontextualize this chapter though, because Oda is probably injecting a lot of his own personal experience to create this wonderful relationship between Harold and Ida. Wonderful and tragic. And the traveling around the world bit, that's a pretty big and personal one. Doesn't Emu taking over Harold near the end of the chapter seem eerily similar to Doflamingo when he controlled King Riku? So Doflamingo has been coming up a lot in these videos lately, despite not having any actual role or even appearance in the series at the moment, but it is for very good reason. As the more we explore Emu, the more it is clear that Doflamingo was trying to emulate Emu just via more rudimentary methods. He was looking to be imbued with the perennial youth of the Yopi Yopi no Mi, and eventually claim the empty throne for himself. And in this chapter, the panel of Emu's eyes above Harold is absolutely horrifying, and it does take me back to the Dressrosa panel of King Riku being puppeteered, with Doflamingo's eyes high above him in the background, being portrayed as this god and or devil-like entity. And I suppose the really cool thing about this tragedy is that we get to show how it worked both ways. With Doflamingo, he successfully controlled King Riku and turned him into a villain of Dressrosa, but Harold's legacy was able to be preserved, assumedly through the actions of Loki and Jarl. Don't know, we'll find out. And I'm not entirely sure what Emu thought was going to happen here, because he can't just force Harold into building an army like Doflamingo forced Riku to kill his citizens, because it would have turned the Giant's Velbath against Harold. And maybe this is the disadvantage of Shanks piecing out and having to upgrade second choice Harold instead. Perhaps what Emu and the elders really needed was more time to corrupt Harold mentally, to stall or incept the idea of raising an army of giants, just in case. So that when he did receive his Depths Covenant, assumedly years, maybe even decades down the line, Harold may have been a bit more cooperative. However, the Riku similarities continue to be very strong, because Riku was the kind of king that Ida convinced Harold to become. He was a man who tried to see things from the eye level of the Tontara tribe, and he wanted both humans and the Tontara to work together for their mutual prosperity. Man, the art in this chapter was so unfinished that I'm sure most didn't even notice Ripley and Colin made an appearance. They sure did. Here they both are in this panel, which is Harold walking out after Ida's death. And seeing Colin here, it is a little bit trippy because this is 15 years ago. But remember that despite looking like a child, Colin is 20 years old in the modern day. I'm honestly curious how Loki killed Harold. Emu made him stronger, so is he around the level of Domi Reversi Rocks or massively weaker? So yeah, what's happened to Harold, it does seem similar to Domi Reversi, extremely similar. From Harold's comments, he is, coursing with powers, but it doesn't appear to have affected his size, so we don't know how much of an upgrade it is. But what I would say is that Harold's power isn't really the issue here, it's the regeneration. As far as we're aware, he's impossible to kill after entering the Depths Covenant, although he can't be all that impossible to kill because he's dead now. So one option would be that Loki and Jarl aren't actually the ones that ultimately killed Harold, because we do know that Emu has the power to kill all of those marked with the Depths Covenant and above, and so Harold could be another Saint Saturn situation where his blunder ends up being ever so great that Emu decides to cut him off from life and dispose of Harold entirely. And I can see that sort of thing happening for the sake of keeping Loki's hands clean. Again, he's an Oda good guy, and Oda doesn't like to have his good guys taking lives even if it's for a justified cause. Looking back on it, Oda didn't even have Roger and Garp be the ones to deal the final blow to Rox. That dishonor was claimed by Garling, thus keeping Roger and Garp's hands somewhat clean in that whole debacle. Although if Loki is the one to figure out how to end his father's life, then it could make a bit more sense for the end of chapter 1151. This was where Emu did the big Elbaf White Hockey Blast, and at the very end Loki says, "Oh, looks like you're gonna need my help after all." And my initial reading of that line was that this hockey, it was just so powerful that it felt like they were going to need all hands on deck to deal with this individual. But it could also be Loki sensing that same sort of presence that infected Harold, because Skopegaban at the very least could detect the difference in this hockey versus normal hockey. And so that's how Loki could end up being freed, by claiming to be the only person who knows how to deal with this special brand of monster. Man on the internet, how's the bingo card looking? It's not amazing, which is a shame because this year it started out so well. And what really derailed us from a bingo this year was this surprise God Valley flashback. That whole story combined with Harold and such has taken up almost half the year. And when we were conjuring the bingo squares at the beginning of 2025, no one dared assume that anything God Valley related would be happening in this arc at all. But in any case, here is where we currently stand. We have gotten 2 more squares filled in with Yamato's cover story ending, as well as an important character death, which was Rox Dizebek. But I suppose you could also now give that to Ida, and after the next chapter, perhaps even Harold. I've also gone and preemptively ticked off the Elbaf doesn't end square. I think that's a fairly safe assumption, but there are 3 things that I cannot believe have not happened yet. One is the Loki Lola proposal, but I am certain that that's going to happen very early next year at some point at the tail end of this flashback. And also Loki being freed. When I was looking at all of your comments to make the bingo for this year, I thought that Loki being freed was practically a free square, because surely he wasn't going to spend another year just in chains. And at one point I did tick it off when Luffy freed him. That was a mistake, because we found out that Luffy, he only freed most of him and Loki was still being held. And if you wanted to get hyper technical, you could maybe fill in this square by saying, man on the internet, Loki was imprisoned in chapter 1168 and he was released later in that very same chapter. That's a Loki free, but that's not really in the spirit of fictional pirate bingo, because it's not what I meant. But the third one I can't believe hasn't happened yet is Loki officially becoming an ally. But I think that's all just because of this unexpected flashback, and a whole ton of this board would be cleared by now if not for that 6-month detour. But look, that just goes to show the wonder of One Piece. Part of the reason why we do these bingos every year is to show how unpredictable the series is. Sure, it feels good to get one right every now and then, and a bingo would be amazing, but I would almost prefer to get nothing right at all, because it means that the year would have been a journey full of unexpected twists and turns, and that is when One Piece is at its best. And we're not done yet for this year. There should still be one more chapter of 2025, and I look forward, well, I don't look forward to it because Harold's probably going to die, but I'm just going to say the thing anyway. I look forward to seeing what happens next, even though I know it's going to be bad. And if you're in the mood for some long-form One Piece content, then please do check out the Calm Belt. It's a whole channel where Grand Line review videos are compiled into 2 to 3 hour compilations, which also feature videos that for one reason or another never made it onto this channel. Curious, yes. And these are for you to have on while you're sleeping, drawing, gaming, or whatever other long-form activities you perform. So definitely check that out through the link in the description.